Well, of course, Thomas Walker is my name. I was born and raised in Tucson, Arizona. Uh, you are familiar with Tucson, with Arizona. I grew up in an environment. I had five older siblings. My father had 10 children. I'm the youngest of his 10. My mom had six. There were six of my moms. So we were all pretty much together. And at birth, we all lived in the same house in Tucson. As time went on, then my mother and dad took us all and moved down the street, so we were all in the same neighborhood. I spent a lot of time at my grandma's. I was the baby, so she kind of kept me close. But I would spend a lot of time with my older brothers and sisters as I got older. But as I got older, I actually really loved being around my dad. I'll never forget Bonanza. That was his. He called it Banana. That was his favorite show, and I always felt like little Joe Cartwright. I'd be sitting next to his knee, and we'd watch the show together once a week. But I was a little boy. Um, when I was 10, when I was 10 years old, my dad would kind of be in and out. He would be in and out of the house. And he would sometimes leave and he'd say, Mom, I'll tell my mom I'd be back in a little while. And it may be 2 hours. Then it would 2 days. Next thing you know, it may be a weekend. Well, this one particular day, I was up in the community park and I was swinging back and forth. I loved the swing because Superman was my guy. And that swing made me feel like Superman. But I like to say at one of my epic swings, at the height of one of my epic swings, a friend of mine ran up to the park. Now, I'm 10 years old. He runs to the park and he says, Tommy Lee, you need to go home. Your dad is beating up your mom. And I jumped out of the swing and I ran home. When I got in front of the house, there was an ambulance in front of the house. It was white, the big red stripes around it, and the doors were open. My mom was in the back of that ambulance on a stretcher. And I remember seeing her face swollen. She had an oxygen mask on and blood running down the front of it. And I stood there paralyzed. They closed the door and they drove off. And I don't even know or didn't know what happened next. And I carried this for a couple of weeks. Again, this was only 6 years ago. I was about 60. And my sister, I called my sister and I asked her, I explained it to her and what I remembered. And I said, did that really happen? And she said, yes, it did. And I said, really? And I said, why did we never talk about it? I said, how do you know? She said, because I walked up and I stood right next to you. And I said, wow. I said, so what happened next? And she said, well, you were always down to Mama Lucy, which was my dear grandmother. And she said, you were down there. I came down there and started living down there with her. And the rest of the family, they were older teens at that point, and everybody scattered. I said, well, where did everybody go? And she said, well, she told me the story. Well, Ronnie and Richard, they kind of stayed at the house a while. Joyce and Larry were old enough to go. Well, Larry went with my mother, and they lived in Seattle. So my mother left town, and they went to Seattle with her brother. And so I said, wow, that was the day that my family fell apart. And but I forgot about it for 50 years of my life. And so I'm at grandma's, and Mama Lucy was a good old Pentecostal mother of the church, and she used to take me to church with her. Nobody else, just me and her and I. And she would get in the car, and when I get in the car with her, she'd always put this white towel over her dress and drive to church. And it never dawned on me, why the white towel? Well, I later realized I'm well in my 20s. My granddad was an auto mechanic and he had greasy hands. So it wasn't nothing spiritual about the towel. She just didn't want grease on her dress. But she took me to church, this little Pentecostal church, where I would see miracles happen, and I'd be down in this little cold basement. But she did. I said she put me on drugs. She drugged me to church on Sunday. She drugged me to prayer meetings. She drugged me to revivals. And but I was her project, and I thank God for her even now because she introduced me to the things of God. Well, family's broken up. Mother's gone. Dad is somewhere. So I come home from school 2 years later. I walk into the house, my grandmother's house. By that time, she's bedridden, and she's in the back of the house, and she would hear me come through the door. Well, this particular day, I walked in the door, and the television was on in the living room, and it said, the news report said, Southside man kills woman in boarding house. News at 5. And I looked at the television, and they were bringing my dad out. He had just killed his mistress. He had shot her, killed her. And I looked at the TV and I thought, oh my God, nobody in the family ever talked about it. He went to prison. Um, Now I'm in the 8th grade, getting ready to go to high school. But when I recall those incidents, uh, it had a profound effect on all of us, including me. In spite of grandma now, she's not up and around anymore. And so now everything is just kind of falling apart. She ultimately went to the nursing home. And I was there with my granddad who worked all the time. Well, um, I get into high school. I get into to high school now, and I'm pretty much without any supervision or guidance, and pretty much taking care of myself. I didn't go to church anymore after my grandmother became bedridden. I didn't continue in church. The siblings were all scattered. I went on into high school at that point, and to this day, I don't know who signed me in or who signed me out of anything. I just learned to manage. I was resilient, able to just keep going. So I get into high school, and of course, I was a 14-year-old boy, so I got myself a girlfriend, and I found myself leaning on her a lot. But I also found myself carrying out the traits of my father. Uh, I started smoking weed and drinking. I was on the football team. I was a pretty decent athlete. Uh, in my sophomore year, I went out for quarterback, and I got the starting position. And we had a great year. But in the end of the football season, I went to school one day. My grandmother wasn't there. She was my rock. And my granddad's working day and night, and I would fall asleep on the couch at night, and I didn't really get a lot of rest. I go to school one day, and the teacher says, uh, I had my head on the desk, and I raised my head up, and the teacher says, uh, told me to stop talking, and I wasn't. And I said some things to her that I shouldn't have said. And she sent me to the dean's office. I get up to go to the dean, and when I left the classroom, I didn't go to the dean. I walked home. And had grandma been there, I would never have done that. I went back to school the next day, and I got kicked out of school. Matter of fact, I had gotten kicked out of the district, and I had never been in trouble in school before. But part of that journey with my older brothers and sisters, particularly my older brothers, they were pretty rough characters for the most part, and so a lot of that was rolling downhill, I believe. Now that I look back on it, and I believe it stemmed from the stigma of my dad and that murderous situation he was in, and the way he treated my mom. I felt like when he killed that lady, the community killed us. And so I've always carried this thing of not being good enough or always have to measure up to something that I maybe was or was not. Well, I ended up going to another high school, Between my junior and senior year in high school, I got my girlfriend pregnant. Now I'm going into my junior year, my senior year, and I've got a baby. Made the football team. Once they found out about the baby, I walked in the locker room one day after for practice, and they cleaned out my locker, and nobody ever said a word to me. Uh, I walked out that day, and I never went back to school. And that was in the first semester of my senior year. My granddad made me get a job to take care of my son, and I ended up finishing night school. Well, I married a young lady, and it didn't work out. I went by to visit her. I had been drinking, and my those characteristics of my upbringing came out, and I got physically aggressive with her, and I realized you just need to leave. I left, went to my apartment, put everything I could put in my car, and I drove to Texas. Um, halfway halfway from Tucson, I got to San Antonio at no El Paso, and I called my mother and I told her what I had done the night before, and I said, call my job and tell them that I'll be back tomorrow. And she said, no, baby, go on. You're gonna be just fine. And I thought, oh Lord, my woman don't want me, my mama don't want me. And I drove on to the Houston area. I knew some people down there, and I knew them, and I knew they would accept me. And so I left Tucson. I get to Texas. I'm 21 years old, and I'm thinking, what have I done? What have I done with my life? The family I went to live with, they went to church every Sunday. I go there. I get in. I get in church with them. I'm going to church every Sunday now. And I used to love to sing. I used to have a little band, and I joined the male chorus. Before you know it, the roots of my upbringing begin to kick in. And I was just enamored by singing in the choir, by them good old Baptist preachers. And it was so inspiring that I wanted to be one. So I accepted a call to ministry and began to go to school. Um, went to Bible college, and but I was still working in industrial sales. And after about 5 or 10 years in this thing, I was still trying to straddle the fence. My feet in the world, feet in the church. I was still trying to do both. And I joined this church, and I met four young men who I'd never seen anything like these guys before. They were committed to the Word of God. They were committed to discipleship, and they were sold out for the things of God. These guys brought me under their wings, and they began to disciple me. And I'd been in church probably 10 years by then, but I didn't know the deeper things of God. And these guys began to disciple me. I started teaching youth Sunday school, and I literally fell in love with it. Um, After teaching for a while, I used to hang out with the youth pastor, go on youth trips, and I became so connected to it. I felt this passion to continue to serve youth. I moved. I moved into a youth ministry position, and this was interesting how it happened. The church that I was at was looking for a youth pastor. The guy we had got called to a church, so I was on an interviewing committee. And everyone that we interviewed would tell the senior pastor, I don't know why you're looking for a youth pastor. You already have one. And he asked me if I wanted that position. And I thought, well, sure. Well, it was part-time. I was working my industrial sales job, and I absolutely loved it. About 3 years in, I ended up had to make a decision whether I was going to be bivocational or whether I was going to just let that go. Well, I ultimately ended up leaving that church, and there was some scandals going on. So I left that church, I kept my job, but then I saw a position in a United Methodist Church. I applied for that youth ministry position. A year later, they brought me on full time, and I left my industrial sales career. I was 38 years old when I did that. I spent 10 years doing that in the Methodist Church. And from the discipleship of these young men, it connected me from things of God that I just never thought I could be there. But I was so engaged in youth ministry. I was so engaged in that work that that's all I wanted to do. So I stayed at this church 10 years. I got my ordination from the Methodist Church at this point. When you do that, you're up to itinerary. They moved me from a suburban church to an inner city church in an area called Third Ward, Houston. And I was between an elementary and a middle school. And I was so connected that to those schools. I'll never forget the middle school pastor told me, he said, I've been here for 8 years and not one pastor in the community has come to visit. But we literally transformed the community through those ministries. And what that did for me is it connected me to urban ministry. And they moved me to another church after 8 years. I stayed there about 2 years. And I recognized that senior pastoring just wasn't my call. My call was to youth ministry. I resigned. I went back to the industry for 2 years, and then I retired. Well, it just so happens that I ran into one of the students that was in the youth ministry from years ago, is now the principal at a high school in inner city Houston. I'm volunteering there now with him, and I'm ministering to high school students. I started writing this book, and what I realized is what I'm doing now has a direct connection to what I was doing, to my growing up. Because in that season of middle school and high school, there was no adult at that point. Grandmother was ill and had ultimately passed. My mom was gone, and so was my dad. And what I'm doing now with middle school and high school students is a direct result of my upbringing. And I recognize now, and even more today, that God had a plan all along. Trust God. Give your life to God and learn to hear his voice and not your own. I didn't say this earlier. My older siblings scattered. My dad had 10 children, as I've said, 7 boys. Out of the 7 boys, there was only one of the 7 that didn't grow up to be an abusive alcoholic man. All of us did, except for the one. The one that did not, he's the only one left. The only one still alive out of my mother's 6. And he's struggling. I fell into the same struggle. One of the things that my friend Bob, when I met him 18 months ago, I walked in and I said, Bob, I'm dead. I don't know. Church didn't fix it. I was once connected. Now I feel so lost. And he grabbed my arm and he did this. He said, the iniquities of your father, of the fathers, have been passed on from generation to generation. You can break those off of you now. And the scripture says he was wounded for our transgressions and bruised for our iniquities. And that opened up a whole new pathway for me, because I understood I didn't fall in that rut on my own. I had help. But just because I had that help doesn't mean I need to stay here. And for the last 18 months, God has been unpacking these things. And what brought me to this whole thing was this book that I mentioned at the beginning, Chip Off the Old Block. And that book, I've completed writing it, but that was for me, because God used that to open up some of my pain, to heal some of my wounds. Now, I would tell someone, let's take a look at what's in your hands. And when I look in my hands now, I've got more in my hands than I could ever use. and God put it there. I just didn't know I had it. So, what I would say is look at what you have and allow God to manifest his greatness out of what he's already, because what I have, he gave it to me all along. That's how I was able to sustain. Unfortunately, with the exception of one, all my siblings are dead. And God allowed me and put me in a position to literally take care of them from birth, from death to burial. And there's a reason for that. And it's because my dear grandmother put me in the arms of the Lord when I was a little boy, and my siblings didn't. She put something in my hands in those days that I didn't even know I had. And when I got to Texas, God said, I've never been anywhere. You just come back to me in a different place. So I would say, trust God. You really have to, not yourself.
Amen.
This is Road Trip. And the introduction, I unpack a portion of my story. And I wrote it with Tom Ziglar. If you all know Tom Ziglar, he's Zig Ziglar's son. And Zig was the number one motivational speaker in the country and around the world for many years. And I got involved with a life coaching program, the Ziglar Life Coach. This is a result of the Ziglar Life Coaching program that that I got involved with. And it's kind of a business card, but it tells my story. But it also opens up an opportunity for me to go in, do some life coaching, and I'm focusing on young youth and young adults and try to give them some life skills that will take them on their journey, on their road trip, and hopefully make their road trip a little easier. And that's what this is. And we talk about spiritual, we talk about career, we talk about family, we talk about their social life. And that's what this book introduces.